May 27th, 1942. Far below the bright Hawaiian morning, in the basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer sat alone with the war. The room had no windows, only humming machines and bad air. IBM sorters clattered, ventilators groaned, and the heat from motors and lamps turned the basement into a stifling mechanical cave. On Dyer's desk, 5-digit number groups sprawled across worksheets and punch cards, the raw language of the enemy. His eyes burned. Benzedrine kept him awake, but it did nothing to lighten the weight that pressed on every calculation, every guess. The pencil in his hand trembled slightly as he added one more notation to a worksheet already filled with tiny, precise markings. Around him rose columns of IBM punch cards stacked in trays and boxes, paper pillars representing months of work and the accumulated strain of a team that had been pushed past normal limits. Each card was a frozen moment of effort, hours of checking, cross-referencing, and arguing over patterns. Together, they were more than paper. They were the only bridge between rows of random numbers and the intentions of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Dyer reached for another handful of punch cards, feeding them into the IBM sorter with movements that had become almost automatic. 5-digit groups flashed past, endless combinations of digits that, if properly stripped, sorted, and understood, formed the closest thing the United States had to reading Japan's mind. Behind him, Commander Joseph Rochefort stood in his usual attire, bathrobe and slippers. To an outsider, it might have looked eccentric, even disrespectful. In reality, it was simple survival. The basement was hot, ventilation was inadequate, and the IBM machines pumped out heat like furnaces. In uniform, men simply wilted. Down here, rank, formality, and appearance had been quietly sacrificed to something more important: results. Above them, 3 floors up, Admiral Chester Nimitz waited in a war room for an answer no one could afford to get wrong. He had 3 carriers left in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown. Japan still had 10 fleet carriers. Nimitz was preparing to gamble what remained of American carrier power on the analysis coming from this basement. If HYPO's conclusions were wrong, if they misread even a few crucial code groups, the gamble could end with American carrier aviation shattered in a single blow. Pearl Harbor had been a warning. Another disaster on that scale might end any hope of stopping Japan before it consolidated its empire. The intercepted messages contained one clear, chilling certainty. The Japanese combined fleet was assembling for its largest operation since December 7th. 4 fleet carriers, an invasion force, supporting battleships and cruisers, and hundreds of highly experienced naval aviators were converging on a target marked only as AF. AF was more than 2 letters. It was the fulcrum on which the Pacific War could tilt irrevocably in Japan's favor. If HYPO identified the wrong location, the United States would send its remaining carriers to the wrong patch of ocean. The Japanese would strike elsewhere, unopposed, and likely destroy what remained of America's ability to contest the Pacific. The mathematics of disaster were simple. Japan, 10 fleet carriers. The United States in the Pacific. 3. One of them, Yorktown, damaged so badly at Coral Sea that some thought she would be out for months. A mistake in that basement could mean those last carriers never came back. The chain of events that led to this moment had begun 6 months earlier, on a peaceful Sunday morning that had shattered illusions in a single stroke. December 7th, 1941, dawned bright and calm over the Hawaiian Islands. Families prepared for church. Sailors aboard battleships moored in Pearl Harbor lounged in hammocks, ate breakfast, or slept in, expecting nothing more dramatic than a routine day in port. The Pacific Fleet sat at anchor, impressive, powerful, and unprepared. No one in those quiet early hours imagined that within minutes history would pivot. At 7:55 a.m., peace ended. Out of the morning sky came 353 Japanese aircraft, descending in 2 meticulously coordinated waves. The attack had been designed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a strategist who understood his country's position with ruthless clarity. Japan, he knew, had a temporary edge in trained pilots and ships, but America possessed an industrial capacity that, once awakened, could outbuild anything Japan could field. His aim was not to win a long war, it was to shock the United States into negotiating from weakness. Smash the Pacific Fleet, gain 6 months to a year to seize territory across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, then demand peace from a position of apparent strength. The results, measured in 2 hours of destruction, were staggering. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. The USS Arizona suffered a catastrophe that eyewitnesses would never forget. A 1,800-pound armor-piercing bomb penetrated her forward magazine. The resulting explosion lifted the 30,000-ton ship out of the water and tore her open. More than 100 men died in seconds, entombed in the hull that would become their permanent grave. USS Oklahoma rolled over after multiple torpedo hits punched open her port side. 429 sailors and Marines were trapped inside. Some survived for days in air pockets, pounding desperately on the hull, while rescuers outside listened, helpless to reach them in time. USS West Virginia settled to the harbor bottom, 106 of her crew killed. She would eventually be refloated, repaired, and returned to battle, but on that day she was another burning symbol of American vulnerability. On airfields and in hangars, destruction was equally thorough. More than 180 American aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. Fuel tanks, maintenance shops, and hangars went up in flames. By day's end, 2,403 Americans were dead, 2,008 from the Navy, 109 from the Marine Corps, 218 from the Army, 68 civilians. Another 1,000 were wounded. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield in the Pacific, lay crippled. From the windows of his headquarters, Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, watched his ships and airfields burn. A spent bullet struck the glass beside him, shattering it. He picked up the deformed bullet and stared at it for a long moment, before quietly remarking to an aide that it would have been merciful had it killed him. He knew what the aftermath would bring: investigation, blame, and the end of his career. He asked for a court-martial to clear his name. That request was denied. Within days he was relieved of command. The burden of Pearl Harbor would follow him to the grave. Yet amid the devastation, the attack had missed what would turn out to be the most important targets of all. Not one of the Pacific Fleet's 3 carriers was in port on December 7th. USS Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, delayed by weather that would prove strangely fortunate. USS Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. USS Saratoga sat in dry dock on the west coast undergoing maintenance. No one fully understood it that morning, but the center of naval power was shifting. Battleships would no longer decide wars at sea. Aircraft carriers would. By chance and by Japanese miscalculation, American carrier power survived. The Japanese had also left Pearl Harbor's infrastructure largely intact. The vast above-ground fuel tanks, holding millions of gallons of oil that kept the fleet moving, were untouched. So were the major repair shops, dry docks, and the submarine base. Japanese planners, confident that the fleet's destruction would make such targets irrelevant, had focused on ships and airfields. They were wrong. Those intact facilities would become the beating heart of America's Pacific counteroffensive. Submarines leaving Pearl Harbor would later tear into Japan's merchant shipping. Shipyards and dry docks would raise damaged ships from the mud, repair them, and send them back to sea. Within months, Pearl Harbor shifted from symbol of defeat to forge of recovery, working around the clock to support a war that, for the moment, was still going badly. Deep in that same base, in the basement that sailors would soon call the dungeon, Commander Joseph Rochefort inherited the impossible task of making sure the United States was never surprised like that again. Before the attack, the Navy's signals intelligence outfit in Hawaii, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, universally known as Station HYPO, had been chasing Japanese communications with limited success. They could read perhaps 10–15% of Japanese naval messages, and often only fragments of those. It was enough to provide hints, but not enough to predict something on the scale of Pearl Harbor. The primary Japanese operational code used by the Imperial Navy was designated JN-25 by American cryptanalysts. It was a monster. The system relied on roughly 33,000 five-digit code groups in actual use, each group representing a word, phrase, or operational concept. A message was first enciphered by replacing words with these five-digit groups from the codebook. Then came the second layer of protection. To make analysis even harder, the Japanese super-enciphered those code groups with random five-digit additive numbers. Using non-carrying addition, they added each digit of a random group to each digit of a code group. The result? Streams of numbers that looked, to any outsider, like random noise, impenetrable to traditional frequency analysis. Breaking JN-25 required 2 feats for every message. Strip off the additive layer by recovering which additive table and starting point had been used. Determine what the underlying five-digit groups from the codebook actually meant. The additive books themselves were immense. 300 pages, each page listing 100 random five-digit numbers. To encrypt, a Japanese communicator would start from a specific page and line, known to sender and receiver, and add each successive additive group to the corresponding code group. The receiver, using the same starting point, would subtract the additives and recover the original code groups. For American cryptanalysts, the first obstacle was figuring out which additive book and which starting position had been used for any given message. Sometimes radio call signs or indicators helped. Often they did not. Analysts might need to test hundreds of possibilities before the additive layer came off and the underlying code groups appeared. Even then, they were not done. Those five-digit numbers were nothing but labels for words in a code book the Americans did not have. HYPO's analysts had to infer meanings from usage patterns across thousands of intercepted messages, seeing where particular groups appeared, with which units, in what operational contexts. And as soon as they made progress, the Japanese would shift the ground beneath them. On December 1st, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese introduced a new version of the system. American analysts called it JN-25B. It used a different code book and new additive tables. Overnight, the painstaking catalog of code groups HYPO had slowly built became obsolete. Methods that had taken years to refine might or might not still apply. When the Pearl Harbor attack came, Rochefort and his colleagues could see the increased radio traffic, the rearranging of call signs, the subtle indicators that something big was in motion. But the strike force that sailed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941, maintained radio silence. 6 carriers and their escorts crossed the Pacific without transmitting a word. You cannot analyze what is never sent. The result was the most profound intelligence failure in American history, not for lack of effort, but for lack of usable signals. Rochefort understood that staring backward at failure would do nothing to prevent the next blow. The only way forward was through the enemy's communications, through JN-25B, through additive tables, through 5-digit number groups that seemed designed to resist every known technique. If Station HYPO could turn those streams of digits into clear language, then perhaps next time the United States would not be caught unprepared. And if they failed, Pearl Harbor's horror might simply repeat itself, this time with carriers at anchor, or with Hawaii itself in the crosshairs. Joseph John Rochefort did not look like the kind of man history would one day credit with changing the course of a world war. He was born in Dayton, Ohio, on May 12, 1900. In 1918, 17 years old and eager to serve, he enlisted in the Navy. To improve his chances for advancement, he quietly altered his birth year to 1898 on his enlistment papers. That small falsification stayed in his service record through his entire career. Rochefort was commissioned an ensign after completing the Navy's steam engineering course at Stevens Institute of Technology on June 14, 1919. Those early years showed nothing spectacular, just a young officer working his way through routine assignments. Then someone noticed something that didn't show up on a fitness report. Rochefort was unusually good at crossword puzzles, and he excelled at auction bridge, a complex card game that rewards memory, pattern recognition, and logical deduction. These weren't party tricks. They were indicators of a mind wired to find structure in confusion, to make sense out of incomplete information. A fellow officer recommended him for the Navy's tiny cryptanalysis program. In the early 1920s, naval cryptology was barely more than a handful of people working in cramped offices, underfunded and largely misunderstood. Their job was to peer into the radio conversations of potential adversaries and see what could be learned. Rochefort took to it with natural ease. But what made him exceptional wasn't just mathematical facility or puzzle-solving skill. In the late 1920s, the Navy sent him to Japan as part of a small group of officers selected for intensive language and cultural training. From 1929 to 1932, he lived in Tokyo, studied Japanese, and absorbed as much as he could about the culture that produced the military machine he might someday have to analyze. He did not simply memorize vocabulary and grammar. He learned how Japanese officers thought and communicated, how concepts of duty, honor, and hierarchy shaped the way they phrased orders. He saw how politeness and indirectness could mask hard instructions, how decisions moved up and down chains of command, how official messages were structured. When he eventually took over Station HYPO, that combination, cryptanalytic training and deep familiarity with Japanese language and culture, made him uniquely suited to the task at hand. His deputy and chief machine cryptanalyst in Hawaii was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a Naval Academy graduate who had studied under one of the greatest figures in American code-breaking, Agnes Driscoll. Driscoll, Miss Aggie, to those who worked with her, had been breaking codes since World War I. She played a central role in cracking Japanese naval systems throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and she became convinced that IBM punch card equipment, originally designed for bookkeeping and tabulation, could be adapted for cryptanalysis. Under her tutelage, Dyer learned to harness those machines to handle the mountains of numerical data that defined JN-25. He developed an almost eerie memory for code groups and a feel for patterns that others missed. Given a partially recovered message, he could often deduce what missing groups represented by matching context with usage from thousands of earlier intercepts. As war approached, Dyer had been at Pearl Harbor since 1936, longer than anyone else in the unit. He knew the rhythms of Japanese communications as intimately as he knew the sound of the IBM machines clacking behind him. When the pressure mounted in 1942, Dyer drove himself mercilessly, often working brutally long shifts with the aid of benzodrine tablets. The Navy issued such stimulants to personnel whose duties required sustained wakefulness far beyond normal limits. Dyer later shrugged off concerns in an oral history, explaining that there were men out there getting shot at, and if his health suffered later, it was a price worth paying. On his desk sat a sign, half joke and half truth. "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." He wasn't wrong. HYPO was an odd corner of the Navy. In the suffocating basement, bathrobes and slippers replaced starched uniforms. Rank, though never abolished, took a back seat to raw analytical ability. The work schedule ignored standard duty hours. Men slept when they collapsed, ate when someone remembered to bring food, and spent the rest of their time staring at numbers. Rochefort cultivated that environment deliberately. To break JN-25 required more than rigid discipline and careful protocol. It demanded imagination, intuition, and relentless testing of assumptions. He drove home one principle repeatedly. We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit. In a rigidly hierarchical institution like the Navy, that philosophy was almost revolutionary. In HYPO's cramped rooms, a junior enlisted operator could challenge the reasoning of a senior officer if the analysis demanded it. A linguist's cultural insight might overturn a cryptanalyst's interpretation. A traffic analyst could reframe an entire problem by pointing out a pattern in call sign changes. Authority in this basement flowed from competence. The linguistics section, led by Marine Captain Alva Laswell, brought another crucial dimension. Laswell, like Rochefort, had spent 3 years studying in Tokyo. By the time war came, he and 5 other linguists represented some of the best Japanese language talent in the Navy. Their job began where the codebreaker's task ended. Once enough code groups were stripped of additives and tentatively assigned meanings, the linguists turned number strings into actual Japanese sentences, then, further, into English translations. But they did more than translate words. They interpreted tone, idioms, and technical phrasing, helping intelligence officers understand what a message meant in operational terms. A message that mentioned carriers, fuel, and aircraft might be routine logistics, or the prelude to a major operation. Linguists helped distinguish between the two. Yet another small team focused on traffic analysis rather than content. Under Lieutenant Commanders Thomas Huckins and John Williams, these analysts studied who talked to whom, how often, with what priorities, and at what times. Without reading a single message, they could sometimes discern that a carrier division was forming up, that an operation was nearing execution, or that a major fleet unit had gone radio silent. A possible sign it was at sea. An increase in traffic between carriers and supply ships, a sudden change in call signs, the abrupt disappearance of a key station from the air, all might signal movement. It was this combination, cryptanalysis, linguistics, traffic analysis, compressed into a single, overworked, underventilated unit that would soon face the greatest challenge in American intelligence history. The work itself was painstaking. Intercept stations scattered across the Pacific, Hawaii, Australia, and other locations listened to Japanese naval frequencies around the clock. Radio men transcribed each message they heard, 5-digit group after 5-digit group, and forwarded these logs to HYPO. Each message arrived as a long string of numbers. First, the cryptanalysts had to identify and remove the additive layer. Since the Japanese used non-carrying addition, a group like 12345 added to 67789 became 79135, each digit added independently. HYPO's analysts spent endless hours building and maintaining files of recovered additives, which ones appeared on which circuits, on what dates, with which kinds of units. They searched for patterns in how Japanese communicators chose starting points in the additive books. When they guessed right and peeled away the additives, the underlying code groups emerged. Then began the second kind of work, intelligence archaeology. HYPO maintained vast card catalogues, each card representing a candidate, meaning for a particular 5-digit group. Analysts combed through messages, looking for associations. This group appeared with carrier units. That one showed up in logistics messages. Another had been seen in orders preceded by date and time indicators. IBM punch card machines made it possible to search large bodies of intercepts quickly for patterns, but the machines could not think. They could sort, count, and correlate. Interpretation still depended on human judgment. Analysts compared partially understood messages, tested hypotheses, and revised old assumptions. A new message might confirm a guess made weeks earlier, or prove that a cherished interpretation had been wrong. Progress came not with eureka moments, but with incremental confirmations, half steps forward, and frequent setbacks. The scale of the code was daunting. With 33,000 groups in actual use and the additive layer constantly shifting, each message represented a multi-dimensional puzzle. Even at their best, by spring 1942, HYPO could read perhaps 30–40% of any given JN25 message. Many remained completely opaque. Still, the wall was beginning to crack. By March 1942, the work was yielding intelligence of real operational value. Pieces of Japanese planning began to come into focus. In early May, that hard-won insight helped shape the Battle of the Coral Sea. HYPO's partial reading of Japanese traffic allowed American commanders to anticipate a move toward Port Moresby and to position their own carriers to respond. Coral Sea ended as a tactical draw, but strategically it halted Japan's advance toward Australia and damaged 2 Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, so badly that they would be unavailable for the next major operation. For the first time in history, opposing fleets fought a naval battle without the main combatants ever seeing each other. Aircraft traded blows. Ships never exchanged gunfire directly. Carrier warfare, hinted at before, had become reality. But to the men in HYPO's basement, the battle was another reminder of how incomplete their understanding remained. Even with months of effort, even with IBM machines running constantly, most messages stayed stubbornly resistant. And the Japanese continued to revise their codes and additives, forcing HYPO to adapt again and again. Each message that yielded nothing represented time that might have been better spent on another problem. And Dyer's team worked under the constant awareness that their success or failure would eventually be measured in American dead and wounded. Then, in mid-May 1942, something new appeared in the radio ether. Traffic surged. Messages flew between combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine units, battleship groups, and transport squadrons. To the analysts mapping such flows on their wall charts, the meaning was immediately clear. Something large and complex was being prepared for early June. In those streams of numbers, a particular indicator began to appear with growing frequency. A location identified as AF. Station HYPO became convinced that AF was Midway Atoll. Midway was little more than a speck of coral and sand. Two small islands, Sand and Eastern, ringed by a reef. Barely 2 miles across, it nevertheless held a critical position, about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, anchoring the Central Pacific. An American airfield there extended the reach of land-based aircraft across vital sea lanes. In Japanese hands, Midway could threaten Hawaii, disrupt communications, and provide a staging ground for further operations. More importantly, an attack on Midway would almost certainly draw out the remaining American carriers. Yamamoto wanted exactly that. Japan's long war in China had given his aviators years of combat experience. In 1942, Japan still enjoyed an edge in pilot skill, tactics, and operational coordination. If he could lure America's carriers into a decisive engagement while that edge remained, he might still achieve the knockout blow Pearl Harbor had not delivered. But in Washington, half a world away, HYPO's counterpart, OP-20G, the main Navy cryptanalysis center, saw things differently. OP-20G in Washington, with more staff and newer equipment, was supposed to be the Navy's central cryptologic authority. From there, work on multiple theaters was coordinated. Analyses were reviewed and distributed through official channels. But they did not have HYPO's accumulated familiarity with Japanese naval traffic in the Pacific, nor did they have Rochefort's and Laswell's intimate sense of Japanese language nuance. Analysts in Washington were not convinced that AF meant Midway. Some suggested it might refer to positions in the Aleutian Islands, far to the north. Others suspected an operation aimed at the South Pacific, Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa. There were even fears of an impending attack against Hawaii itself or the American West Coast. Without agreement on AF's identity, Nimitz faced an impossible choice. If he concentrated his carriers around Midway and the Japanese went somewhere else, he might lose both the ships and the true target. If he dispersed his forces, he risked being too weak wherever the blow fell. The disagreement was amplified by personalities and recent bureaucratic changes. In Washington, OP-20G had recently been reorganized. Its earlier leader, Captain Lawrence Safford, often called the father of U.S. Navy cryptology, had been replaced. His successor, Commander John Redman, was an able communications officer but had little background in cryptanalysis. Redman naturally viewed things through a communications officer's lens. Proper channels, clear chains of authority, centralized control. From that perspective, Rochefort's informal, direct line from HYPO to Nimitz's intelligence officer in Pearl Harbor looked irregular and even insubordinate. For years, Rochefort had sent his assessments directly to Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence chief, and an old friend from their days studying in Tokyo between 1929 and 1932. Layton took HYPO's work straight to the fleet commander. The process was fast and efficient, but it bypassed Washington. To OP-20G, this was a threat to centralized control. To Rochefort and Leighton, it was simple necessity. War did not wait for files to travel up and down organizational ladders. Nimitz needed intelligence in hours, not days. At the top of the Navy's command structure stood Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. Brilliant, abrasive, and intensely protective of his authority, King trusted his Washington staff more than an unconventional officer in a Hawaiian basement. He disliked Rochefort's independence and reputation for disregarding formalities. When HYPO asserted that AF was Midway and that a major operation was coming in early June, OP-20G pushed back. Their own incomplete reading of JN-25 and their traffic analysis pointed in different directions, and they had not broken a critical piece of the Japanese system, the super-enciphered date-time groups. HYPO had. The breakthrough came from Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, working under Dyer. The Japanese had cloaked their date-time groups in an extra layer of encryption on top of JN-25 using a separate method. That meant that even when analysts stripped off the standard additive and recovered code groups, the parts of messages that denoted dates and times remained opaque. Finnegan discovered the pattern behind that extra layer and figured out how to reverse it. With that key, HYPO could anchor Japanese plans in time as well as space. They could see not only what was being arranged and where, but when it was supposed to happen. From Washington's perspective, HYPO's confidence looked reckless. From HYPO's perspective, Washington's skepticism looked like dangerous timidity. The stalemate might have continued, but one of Rochefort's officers, Captain Wilfred J. Jasper Holmes, a submariner turned intelligence man, offered a simple, operationally minded idea that would cut through the uncertainty. If AF really meant Midway, then Japanese communications should respond to any apparent trouble on Midway. So, Holmes proposed, let Midway send an unencrypted emergency message complaining of a breakdown in its water desalination plant and a resulting shortage of fresh water. If Japanese intercept units picked up that message, their reports should refer to AF having water problems. The brilliance of the idea lay in its simplicity. Water systems failed all the time in tropical island bases. There was nothing implausible about such an emergency. And Japanese intelligence, reading American traffic just as HYPO read Japanese messages, would have no reason to suspect a trap. Rochefort immediately saw the value of the plan and took it to Leighton, who brought it to Nimitz. The Admiral did not hesitate. Using secure undersea cable, safe from enemy interception, the Pacific Command passed instructions to Midway's garrison. Around May 19th-21st, 1942, Midway transmitted a plain-language radio message reporting that its water plant was down and that the base was short of fresh water, requesting emergency supplies. Within roughly 2 days, HYPO intercepted a Japanese message in JN-25 from a Japanese intelligence unit. Once the additive layer was peeled away and the meaning of key groups inferred, the content was unmistakable. AF, the message reported, was running low on water. The question that had haunted HYPO for weeks was answered in a single stroke. AF was Midway. Even so, disagreement with Washington did not vanish. OP-20G still believed the attack schedule pointed to mid-June, while HYPO, thanks to Finnegan's date-time breakthrough, argued for the first week of June. On May 26th, HYPO decrypted orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports, including encrypted date-time groups. Using Finnegan's method, they translated those into specific dates, June 4th or 5th. The level of detail now at Rochefort's disposal was extraordinary. By late May, HYPO could outline not just the target, but the shape of the Japanese operation. The planned force included 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same elite carriers that had led the Pearl Harbor strike. 2 battleships would accompany them, along with 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 12 destroyers. Around 5,000 troops were slated to land on Midway around June 7th, once the island had been bombed into submission. The carriers would bring roughly 250 aircraft, flown by crews hardened in campaigns from China to the Indian Ocean, perhaps the most experienced naval aviators in the world. HYPO also discerned Yamamoto's broader concept. The carrier striking force would move in ahead of the main body, smash Midway, draw out American carriers, and destroy them. A separate element would move against the Aleutians, creating a diversion and stretching American defenses. On May 27, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Rochefort and Leighton carried this picture into a Pacific Fleet staff conference with Nimitz. The room was full of officers, many of them skeptical that anyone could possibly know so much about the enemy's plans in advance. Rochefort, unconcerned with appearances, reportedly showed up in his standard basement attire, his bathrobe and slippers a reminder of where the real work was being done. He walked them through the evidence, partial decrypts, traffic patterns, date-time interpretations. Leighton supplemented with operational context and a clear narrative. 4 carriers, an invasion force, early June, Midway the target. But intelligence alone would not win the coming fight. Nimitz still had only 3 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet fit for duty, Yorktown heavily damaged at Coral Sea. Initial estimates said she needed 3 months in a major yard like Puget Sound to be fully repaired. Her flight deck and internal structures were damaged. Her fuel system had been battered. Fires had killed dozens of her crew. Nimitz refused to accept that timetable. If the battle was truly coming in early June, he could not afford to fight with only 2 carriers. He told Pearl Harbor's repair crews they had 3 days to make Yorktown ready for one more battle, not perfectly restored, but capable of operating aircraft safely. The request bordered on impossible. Jobs normally measured in weeks or months would have to be compressed into hours. When Yorktown entered Dry Dock No. 1 at 11 a.m. on May 28th, more than 1,400 workers swarmed aboard. Welders attacked the damaged sections of the flight deck. Electricians ran new lines. Damage control teams patched holes with whatever would hold. Some repairs were temporary and crude. All had to be good enough. The work continued around the clock. When Yorktown steamed out on the morning of May 30th, heading to join Enterprise and Hornet, some repair crews were still aboard, finishing jobs as she gathered speed. Roughly 48 to 72 hours of furious effort had achieved what had seemed unattainable. The damaged carrier was battle-worthy. Against Japan's 4 elite carriers, Nimitz would now have 3 American carriers. His pilots were less experienced. The United States had been at war for barely 6 months, while Japanese aviators had been fighting since 1937. They had honed tactics in the skies over China, drilled in coordinated carrier operations, and flown together in tightly knit air groups. Still, Nimitz had something Yamamoto did not, a clear picture of where and when the enemy would appear. He chose a point northeast of Midway, codenamed Point Luck, and ordered his carriers to gather there. Instead of reacting to a Japanese blow, they would lie in wait, invisible beyond the horizon, ready to strike when the Japanese revealed themselves. The Japanese, for their part, sailed toward Midway, confident that their codes were secure and their enemy in the dark. Naval intelligence had assured Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the carrier task force commander, that Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea and that Enterprise and Hornet could not possibly arrive in time. The trap Nimitz was setting depended entirely on the work of exhausted men in a sweltering basement, hunched over punch cards and worksheets. If Rochefort's team was wrong about any essential element, position, date, composition, Nimitz's 3 carriers might steam into an empty ocean while the Japanese struck elsewhere, or worse, find themselves ambushed instead. It was difficult to imagine a higher-risk bet. On June 3, 1942, the test began. Patrol aircraft, PBY Catalina flying boats, fanned out from Midway across the open Pacific, searching the sectors HYPO had indicated. These lumbering seaplanes flew at the edge of their range, peering down at endless ocean. Then, just as HYPO's analysis had suggested, they found them. First came reports of the invasion transports and their destroyer escorts approaching Midway from the northwest. Soon after, scouts located elements of the carrier force. positions, course, and timing matched HYPO's predictions with startling precision. For Nimitz, far away at his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, the confirmation was more than a relief. It was proof that the months of grinding effort in that basement had purchased something priceless: foreknowledge. The trap was set. Now it would be up to the aviators and sailors to spring it. At dawn on June 4, 1942, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind and began launching their strike on Midway. From Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, a total of 108 aircraft lifted off: 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, this time armed with land attack bombs, 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters as escort. Climbing into the morning sky, they formed up into a dense strike package and headed for Midway. On the atoll, American radar picked up the incoming formation at about 05:45 hours, 93 miles out. Sirens wailed. Ground crews raced to scramble every aircraft that could fly. Marine Corps fighters, many flying outdated F-2A Buffaloes, clawed into the air alongside more modern F-4F Wildcats. Army Air Force's bombers and Navy torpedo planes based on Midway also prepared to meet the raid. The defenders fought with determination, but the disparity was brutal. Japanese Zero pilots, veterans of years of combat, tore into the intercepting fighters. Marine units flying Buffaloes suffered devastating losses. Ground anti-aircraft fire claimed some Japanese aircraft, but not enough. Bombs and strafing runs hammered Midway's facilities. Fuel tanks erupted. Hangars and command posts were wrecked. Runways were damaged, but not destroyed. Some American aircraft survived, and the base remained partially functional. The Japanese strike leader evaluated the damage and radioed a critical assessment back to the carriers. The target had been hit hard, but a second strike would be required to fully neutralize Midway. Aboard his flagship, Akagi, Admiral Nagumo weighed his options. Doctrine suggested he should finish the job. He had additional aircraft ready as a reserve, planes that, according to the pre-battle plan, were to be used either for a second strike on Midway or for anti-ship operations if American vessels appeared. On the carrier hangar decks, ordnance crews had begun rearming these reserve aircraft according to the initial assumption. Midway first. Armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes suitable for attacking ships were being removed. High-explosive bombs for land targets, ideal for wrecking airfields and fuel storage, were being brought up and loaded. Then, at 7:28 a.m., a Japanese scout plane, late in launching due to a catapult problem, sent a message that changed everything. It had spotted a group of American ships to the northeast. 10 vessels, types initially unidentified. The possibility Nagumo had been told was unlikely. That American carriers were close enough to threaten his force could no longer be dismissed. If carriers were among those ships, they represented a danger far greater than Midway's remaining aircraft. He immediately ordered the rearming process reversed. On all 4 carriers, crews scrambled to swap land attack loads for ship-killing weapons. Bombs that had just been mounted were taken off again and sent below. Torpedoes were hoisted up from magazines, maneuvered into position, and affixed to aircraft. Time was now the enemy. Planes returning from the first strike needed to land and refuel. The reserve aircraft needed to be ready for launch against any American ships, especially carriers, before those ships could strike first. Hangar and flight decks descended into a dangerous mixture of urgency and clutter. Fuel lines snaked among stacks of bombs, torpedoes, and partially armed aircraft. There was no time to secure everything properly. Aviation gasoline fumes mingled with the heat of the late morning and the sparks of frantic work. Above this, Japanese fighters remained heavily engaged. While Nagumo's crews worked, American aircraft from Midway struck back. Marine dive bombers, Army B-17s, and other planes attacked the Japanese formation in waves. Most of their attacks failed to score hits. Many of the aircraft were shot down. But their presence forced Japanese fighters to remain at high tempo, intercepting one threat after another, burning fuel and attention. Meanwhile, far to the east, the American carriers were launching their own strikes. From Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, torpedo squadrons and dive bomber groups took off in multiple waves, aiming for the coordinates provided by scouting reports and adjusted as new sightings came in. Coordination between these groups was imperfect. Navigation errors, wind, and scattered information caused formations to become separated. Torpedo squadrons in slower, obsolete TBD Devastators flew at low altitude, heading straight toward the enemy at speeds that made them easy prey for Zeros. They attacked anyway. One by one, the torpedo squadrons pushed in. VT-8 from Hornet, VT-6 from Enterprise, and VT-3 from Yorktown approached at wave-top height, trying to get close enough to release their torpedoes. The cost was horrific. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo found its mark. Pilots and crewmen went into the sea, their sacrifice yielding no visible damage. But they had done something vital. To stop those torpedo attacks, Japanese fighters had been drawn down to low altitude. Defensive formations were disrupted. Attention was fixed on threats skimming the waves. High above, unseen for the moment, dive bombers were closing in. From Enterprise came squadrons led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. During their flight, they had lost contact with their fighter escort and separated from other groups. Following the last known bearing of the enemy, they flew on until they were in danger of running low on fuel. McCluskey gambled. Rather than turn back to preserve his force, he extended the search. Then, by chance and intuition, he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing at high speed. Reasoning that the destroyer must be hurrying to rejoin the main body, he followed its wake. The decision led him straight to the Japanese carriers. From Yorktown came another group of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, also converging on the enemy. At 10:22 a.m., the dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet. 4 carriers lay below, turning into the wind, decks crowded with refueled and partially rearmed aircraft. Flight and hangar decks were cluttered with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines. Combat air patrol fighters, largely at low level after countering torpedo attacks, were badly out of position to contest a sudden, steep-angle assault from high altitude. McCluskey's group split, one squadron peeling off toward Kaga, another toward Akagi. Yorktown's bombers turned toward Soryu. Then, one after another, dauntless pilots pushed over. From 14,000 feet, they dropped into near-vertical dives, dive brakes deployed, bomb sights fixed on long, vulnerable decks below. Wind screamed around canopies as they fell at speeds approaching 250 knots. Anti-aircraft guns on the Japanese ships opened up, filling the air with black bursts and shrapnel. But the attack was already in motion. What followed took roughly 6 minutes. 3 carriers were fatally struck. Akagi was hit by a bomb that punched through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar among fueled and armed aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Aviation gasoline spilled, ignited, and turned compartments into furnaces. Fires spread beyond control. Nagumo and his staff were forced to abandon the flagship. Kaga took multiple direct hits in quick succession. One bomb obliterated the forward part of the flight deck. Others smashed into the midsection. Fires engulfed the ship from bow to stern. Explosions continued for hours. Her captain ordered abandon ship but remained aboard, going down with his carrier. Soryu received 3 devastating hits. The flight deck buckled. Hangars below, filled with aircraft and ordnance, erupted in flames. Her crew fought to contain the damage, but within 20 minutes the situation was hopeless. The captain ordered the crew to abandon ship and stayed behind. Soryu would sink later, taking hundreds of men with her. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been operating at a slight remove and escaped the initial onslaught. She rallied what remained of the Japanese air power and launched counterstrikes that found Yorktown. Skillful Japanese pilots hit the American carrier with bombs and torpedoes that crippled her, bringing her to a halt. For a time, Yorktown's damage control teams gave hope that she might be saved. Fires were fought, flooding contained, listing corrected. She even resumed limited operations. But Hiryu's reprieve did not last. Later in the afternoon, American dive bombers found her as well. Like her sister ships, she was struck, set ablaze, and eventually abandoned. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor lay sinking or fatally damaged. The core of Japan's carrier striking power was gone. Japan lost roughly 3,057 men in the battle, including many of her most experienced pilots, flight deck crews, and technicians. Among the dead were veterans who had bombed Pearl Harbor, sunk British capital ships, and led operations across the Pacific's first 6 months of devastation. The United States lost Yorktown. On June 6th, while under tow and awaiting permanent repair, she was located by the Japanese submarine I-168. 2 torpedoes from the submarine struck her hull. A 3rd torpedo hit the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside providing power and support. Hammond sank quickly. Yorktown rolled and went down the next day, June 7th. American casualties for the battle totaled 362 men, yet in 6 decisive minutes of dive bombing, enabled by months of agonizing cryptanalytic work, the trajectory of the Pacific War shifted. Japan had started the war with overwhelming carrier dominance. After Midway, 4 of her 6 frontline carriers were gone. Japanese industry could not replace them, not at the same speed or in the same numbers. The United States, by contrast, was already building the Essex-class carriers and light carriers that would soon begin arriving in theater, each one a new, powerful platform for naval aviation. From Midway onward, Japan would fight mostly on the defensive. The initiative slipped away, not in a single instant, but through a chain of cause and effect. Months of code breaking, a deception about water, Finnegan's solution to the date-time cipher, Nimitz's gamble at point luck, and the courage of air crews who kept flying into fire. Diving dauntlesses had delivered the fatal blows, but the battle had been shaped in a windowless room where 5-digit numbers had been turned into understanding. The Japanese carriers burned in the Pacific, and with them burned Yamamoto's hope for a quick, decisive war. The victory at Midway did not end the internal conflict over who deserved credit for the intelligence that made it possible. If anything, the success intensified the bureaucratic war between Station HYPO and OP-20G. Both organizations claimed to have played critical roles. Washington analysts argued that their work had contributed significantly to the victory, while HYPO maintained that their specific breakthroughs, AF as Midway, the date-time decryption, the detailed order of battle, had been decisive. Personal resentments sharpened these disputes. Commander John Redman resented Rochefort's independence and direct access to Nimitz. His brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, held a senior post in naval communications and backed efforts to centralize cryptanalysis under Washington's control. Admiral Ernest King, already suspicious of Rochefort, sided with the Redman brothers. In his view, intelligence needed to be controlled from the center, not generated by far-flung officers who seemed too willing to ignore formal hierarchy. The consequences for Rochefort were swift. In October 1942, just 4 months after Midway, he was relieved as head of Station HYPO. Officially, the reason given was that he needed sea duty for career advancement. Unofficially, everyone understood it as punishment. Instead of another cryptanalytic assignment or a high-profile combat posting, Rochefort was sent to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco, an important job in its own way, but far removed from the center of strategic decision-making and entirely disconnected from the work he had proved so adept at. Admiral Nimitz was furious, but he could not override King. The chief of naval operations outranked the Pacific Fleet commander. In a clash between Washington and Pearl Harbor, Washington would win. Nimitz tried to secure recognition for Rochefort's contributions. He recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal, citing his sustained superior performance and specifying that his intelligence work had contributed, in large measure, to the victory at Midway. King's office denied the award. Rochefort never returned to cryptanalysis. After the floating dry dock command, he was reassigned to administrative roles in Pacific Fleet headquarters. He never received the sea command he had hoped for, and never rose above the rank of captain. When he retired in 1953, it was without the honors that Midway's story might have suggested. While personalities clashed and careers were redirected, the work of signals intelligence in the Pacific did not stop. Under new leadership, Station HYPO continued to labor over Japanese communications. Their output fed into one campaign after another. During the bitter struggle for Guadalcanal, 6 months of brutal land, sea, and air combat, intelligence from decrypted messages helped American commanders anticipate Japanese attempts to reinforce the island, identify approaching convoys, and prepare for night surface actions in the waters around Iron Bottom Sound. As the United States moved to an island-hopping strategy, bypassing some heavily fortified Japanese bases to seize others of greater strategic value, signals intelligence helped planners decide where enemy forces were thinnest, where defenses were being strengthened, and where the Japanese expected attacks. The methods honed against JN-25 at HYPO became part of a broader, integrated approach, combining cryptanalysis, traffic analysis, radio direction finding, and human observation into a single intelligence picture. One of the most dramatic direct uses of decrypted Japanese communications came in April 1943 in an operation that would later be known as Vengeance. By then, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the strategist behind Japan's early campaigns, was still a central figure in Japanese naval planning. In April, he planned an inspection tour of frontline units in the Solomon Islands, flying from Rabaul to Bougainville. His staff transmitted a detailed itinerary, departure time, route, aircraft type, and estimated arrival over communications that American codebreakers were monitoring. Station HYPO and its counterparts intercepted and decrypted those messages, uncovering Yamamoto's precise movements. The intelligence reached the highest levels, including President Franklin Roosevelt, who authorized an operation to intercept and kill Yamamoto. A group of 18 P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal on an extraordinarily long-range mission, guided by the decrypted schedule. They arrived over Bougainville at exactly the right time, spotted Yamamoto's transport, and shot it down. The admiral died in the jungle below, along with most of his staff. It was a clear demonstration that the same cryptanalytic machinery that had helped win Midway could also be wielded as a scalpel aimed directly at the enemy's leadership. Through all this, many of the key Midway figures followed their own paths. Thomas Dyer remained at HYPO throughout the war, rising to captain. Within cryptologic circles, his contributions to the use of IBM punch-card machines for cryptanalysis earned him a reputation as the father of machine cryptanalysis. After the war, he became one of the core trainers at the Armed Forces Security Agency and later the National Security Agency, alongside legendary figures like William Friedman and Lambros Kalimahos. Generations of signals intelligence officers would absorb methods shaped by his wartime experience. Edwin Layton stayed at Nimitz's side as intelligence officer, serving through the Pacific War and retiring as a rear admiral. He never forgot what Rochefort had done, or what had been done to him. Decades later, in his memoir And I Was There, Layton documented both HYPO's achievements and the injustice of Rochefort's treatment, keeping the story alive long after many would have preferred it forgotten. Joseph Finnegan, whose discovery of the date-time superensiferment had allowed HYPO to pin down June 4th as the critical day, remained in cryptanalysis after the war and became a leading figure in American signals intelligence. Without his work, Nimitz might have known that Midway was the target, but not when to be there. Countless others from the basement, the linguists, traffic analysts, and radio intercept operators went on with their lives in quiet obscurity. Most could not talk openly about what they had done. Their work remained shielded by layers of classification. For decades after the war, the scope of American success against Japanese codes remained hidden from the public. Historians wrote about Midway as a battle of courage and luck, without knowing how deeply intelligence had shaped the engagement. Families of HYPO veterans saw fathers and husbands who had spent the war in Hawaii, seemingly far from the front, without understanding that those men had helped decide battles across half an ocean. Only in the 1970s, When the National Security Agency began declassifying World War II cryptologic records, did the full picture emerge. Historians could finally see just how thoroughly American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese communications and how often commanders had relied on that insight. The story of JN-25, of the water ruse, of AF as Midway, and of the basement at Pearl Harbor began to surface. So too did the details of Rochefort's removal and the denial of his medal. In 1980, a campaign began to correct that record. Spearheaded by Admiral Donald Mack Showers, who had worked in wartime naval intelligence and later at the CIA, and supported by Navy Secretary John Lehman, the effort sought to secure official recognition for Rochefort's contributions. The declassified documents provided what the advocates needed: proof. Memos, intercept logs, and contemporary evaluations showed that HYPO had indeed provided the decisive intelligence about Midway, and that Nimitz's assessment of Rochefort had been accurate from the start. On May 30, 1986, nearly 44 years after the Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan awarded the Distinguished Service Medal to Joseph Rochefort, posthumously. Rochefort had died a decade earlier, on July 20, 1976, in Torrance, California, at the age of 76. He never lived to see the medal for which Nimitz had argued. His children accepted the award in his place at the White House. The citation described his sustained superior performance and noted that his intelligence work had contributed, in large measure, to the victory at Midway. The language was measured, almost understated, given that his team's work had changed the course of the war. By then, the story had become clearer, not only to historians, but to the veterans themselves. In 1985, surviving members of Station HYPO and other Pacific cryptologic units gathered for a reunion. Men now in their 60s and 70s met to remember a time when they were young, overworked, and often half delirious with exhaustion in a basement that had no windows and no glory. For many, it was the first occasion on which they could speak freely about what they had done. Classification rules had finally loosened enough to allow real stories. They remembered the days and nights when the IBM machines filled the air with heat and noise. They remembered arguments over code groups that lasted until dawn. They remembered the water ruse, the thrill when AF short of water appeared in a Japanese message, and the moment when Finnegan's solution to the date-time cipher turned scattered evidence into a precise schedule. They remembered May 27, 1942, when Rochefort and Leighton went upstairs to present their findings to Nimitz, and the quiet confidence with which Rochefort staked his career, and perhaps his future in the Navy, on his team's analysis. They remembered June 4th, listening to fragmentary reports come back from Midway and the carrier task forces, realizing that the battle unfolding over the horizon was being fought according to a script they had, in large part, already read. Some wept as they recalled colleagues who had not survived the war. Others spoke of the surreal distance between their basement work and the flaming decks of ships they would never see. At the reunion's close, one of the former cryptanalysts rose to speak. His words, shared among men who had spent a lifetime not talking about their greatest achievement, distilled what they all felt. He reminded them that they had entered the war as mathematicians, linguists, engineers, puzzle solvers. They had left it as people whose work had quietly reshaped history, not with guns or bombs, but with understanding. They had read the enemy's intentions and, by doing so, had saved thousands of American lives and shortened a brutal war. Some had been recognized. Many had not. Rochefort, he said, had sacrificed his career rather than play politics with intelligence. Dyer had worked until exhaustion, propped up by Benzedrine, when others might have left the basement and rested. He concluded with a simple assertion that they had proved knowledge was power, that understanding an enemy could defeat him as surely as superior firepower, and that a small, determined group working in obscurity could achieve what most considered impossible. The story of JN-25 and the team that cracked it is, at its core, a story about human capability under pressure. They worked with pencils, paper, and punch cards, not digital computers or automated algorithms. They confronted a system designed to be unbreakable, approximately 33,000 code groups, super-enciphered, changed regularly, used by a foe convinced of its security. They succeeded not because they were lucky, but because they refused to quit. They brought together mathematics, linguistics, cultural insight, and operational understanding. They created an environment in which rank mattered less than ideas, where teamwork trumped ego, where a good hypothesis could come from any desk. They were supported by commanders willing to trust them. Nimitz accepted the risk of acting on their analysis even when it contradicted more cautious views in Washington. He sent his last 3 carriers into a trap he believed he was setting for the enemy, not walking into himself, because he believed in the quality of the intelligence. The Battle of Midway was fought in many places, over the atoll itself, on the flight decks of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, in the cockpits of dive bombers plunging through flak, in the engine rooms and damage control parties of ships under attack. But it was made possible in a basement beneath Pearl Harbor, where 5-digit numbers on punch cards were turned into knowledge, where men worked in bathrobes because the heat made uniforms intolerable, where coffee, cigarettes, and benzodrine replaced sleep, where every intercepted message represented both a riddle and a responsibility. June 4th, 1942, is remembered as the day American dive bombers found Japanese carriers at the moment of maximum vulnerability and destroyed 3 of them in minutes. It is remembered as a turning point. But the true transformation began long before, in the months when those carriers were still invincible in Japanese eyes, and when a small group of analysts refused to accept that JN-25 was unbreakable. They were sailors, marines, officers, mathematicians, linguists, radio operators. They were the codebreakers who gave the United States the intelligence it needed to win Midway, and ultimately to win the war in the Pacific. Their story stands as a reminder that wars are not decided solely by those who pull triggers or press attack buttons. They are also decided by those who sit in dim rooms, stare at numbers, and insist on finding the meaning hidden inside them. In the end, the man in the bathrobe in the Pearl Harbor basement, Joseph Rochefort, helped win a battle he never saw. He died before his medal was pinned, but his legacy lives on in every intelligence officer who understands that truth is a weapon, and in every commander who has the courage to use it.